everybody. Welcome back to English 221, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 5th of March, where we are transitioning from Midsummer Night's Dream to Much Ado About Nothing. And I also wanted to talk about our first paper, which I had initially indicated on the syllabus would be due the Monday after spring break, but I think it makes more sense to have that due the Wednesday after spring break, so that would be on the 26th, via PDF to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, which is how my grading program works best. Approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to be able to support your thesis. And what I had done was I had given you a paper topic that was a quotation from Alexander Anixt. Don't ask for simple answers from Shakespeare. Just believe in his ability to put into one play a whole world with all of its contradictions, contrasts, and problems. Asking you to apply that to the text you've selected for your paper. But you can also create your own essay topic. Just make sure that you have that essay topic approved by me. And it is about one of the Shakespearean texts we are studying over the course of the semester. And the first paper probably will be either on Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. The sonnets are a possibility, but writing about sonnets a very different kind of experience than writing about a drama, but I'm not averse to it. And then your second paper, which would be due at the ending of the semester, would be comparable, but just on a different play, which would probably be the history play, which is what we will read after Much Ado About Nothing, which is Richard II, or our two tragedies, which is how we are ending this semester with Macbeth and Othello. I had assigned The Tempest as an extra credit, and it's purely that, an extra credit. It's not a play that you necessarily have to respond to, but or even read, but it is an important play, as we'll talk about, and I'll talk more when we get a little bit closer to the ending of the semester about why it is that I wanted to include The Tempest, but include it as an extra credit. So, what I wanted to do today was to briefly just talk about the conventions for writing a paper. So, I hope that this is review. And you will note in your syllabus and other documents folder that I have uploaded a handout entitled The Critical Paper, which, believe it or not, was actually given to me when I was an undergraduate student. And I've kept it all these years. It's one of the best ones I can find about writing a paper. So, this handout talks a little bit about the 3 stages of writing. And as you know, I usually encourage you to make hard copies of anything that I upload, or to print hard copies of anything that I upload onto our critical in our syllabus and other documents folder. So, the planning stage, the writing stage, and the editing stage. And I can tell you that most writers skip the planning stage, much to their detriment. They go straight to writing, and they end up usually wasting a lot of time trying to write the perfect first sentence. So, I encourage you to spend some time planning, brainstorming, coming up with ideas. Then you can begin to write. And as a very wise professor of mine once said, a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And you could continue to polish and improve your writing, but basically you've got a deadline. So the reality is that you can't spend years on this, you'd spend weeks on this. And of course you edit before you submit. Hopefully there's enough time so that you can take a break from writing the paper to actually rereading it before you submit, so that you can find errors. So, just a couple of points. You want to make sure you've got a good introductory paragraph, and that is your first paragraph that has your thesis, which is your main point, and it also lists the author and the text in which you are discussing for the paper. And then you want to have body paragraphs, and those are the mid paragraphs that serve to provide evidence. That's usually a combination of direct quotation and paraphrase, as well as your own analysis. And then you want to have a last paragraph, your concluding paragraph, and this gives the reader a sense of closure. And for each of these paragraphs, you want to remember that a paragraph is at least 3 sentences, hopefully a lot longer than that. So each paragraph should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that first sentence is known as the topic sentence. And more often than not, that first sentence serves as a summary of all of the information you're going to be discussing in your paragraph. So, in theory, what you should be able to do is to read the first sentences of all of your paragraphs and basically get an outline of what it is that you've written. And going to the handout about the critical paper, which I had uploaded, it talks about that you want to analyze and not summarize. So assume the reader has some familiarity with the text. You only need to retell those pieces that are necessary to support your particular position. So begin with a strong and specific thesis, something that implies interpretations. And you want to make sure that it's comprehensive enough to be important, but not so general or bland as to be meaningless. And the example in the handout is, for instance, saying something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience, which is so broad it applies to just about every author and every text. Or saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, my first response as a reader is, well, so what? What imagery is employed and how and why is it important? That'll be the thesis. So you need to support your arguments because basically I'm taking the opposite position of whatever it is you argue. So this is where you give some paraphrase, reference to the text, and some direct quotation where appropriate. You want to avoid the extremes. You don't want to have so much quotation that really your paper is just a long quote of the Shakespearean play. Sometimes that's known as padding the paper and adding quotes just to give it length. But you also don't want to have a paper with no quotations either. And generally speaking, ending a paragraph with a quote is bad practice because you usually want to comment on the relevance of that quote. But again, that's generally speaking. So that said, the writing piece, which the handout talks about, that the first principle of good writing is economy and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So basically what you should be able to do is to go through each of your sentences and ask yourself, can I rephrase this sentence in fewer words? And if the answer is yes, 9 out of 10 times you should do that. And yes, I know you lose length doing that. You want to have length based on ideas, not with unnecessary language. So you want to have strong verbs and nouns, adjectives and adverbs, descriptor words. Be careful with those. You don't want to use them just to pad or to increase the length of your paper. The active to the passive voice. So you want it to be very clear that the subject of the sentence, and the subject of the sentence is who or what is performing the action in the sentence, that the subject of the sentence is clearly performing an action. Something like Lillian graded the papers. That would be active. Passive would be as if the action is happening to the subject. The papers were graded by Lillian would be an example. But if this is too difficult to sort of wrap your mind around, just do a simple count. Lillian graded the papers as 4 sentences, or 4 words, I should say, rather than the papers were graded by Lillian. 6 words. So just going back to the rule of being concise, use the fewest words necessary in order to be able to support your position or to express your idea. So vary your sentences. You should have a mix of some long ones and some short ones. Too many short ones together, the paper sounds choppy. Too many long ones together, it sounds rather complex. And you want to make sure that you're varying the sentence opening so that you don't have multiple sentences, especially if they're appearing one after another, starting the same way. And you want to avoid cliches, which is an overused expression, which no longer has any kind of originality because it is overused. In fact, some of these cliches were created by Shakespeare, though of course they were original at the time. So if you ever heard of Jealousy's That Green-Eyed Monster, we'll talk about that when we get to Othello, which is, again, at the time would have been a unique phrase, but now it's considered to be rather trite or cliche. And you also want to avoid slang just because there's a greater possibility of misunderstanding, because slang is just informal language that's meant to exclude certain audiences or demographics. Think about what adolescents oftentimes do is create their own slang, even though slang will oftentimes go mainstream. So it's considered informal. And these rules actually are the rules of writing in the business world as well as the rules of writing in academia. So they translate over pretty well. And even though this is counterintuitive, you want to maintain the present tense when you're writing about a piece of literature. It's as if things are happening in the now. That's what makes the literature timeless and universal, rather than talking about it in the past. Even though I know it was written in the past and you read it in the past, you should refer to it in the present. So if you have difficulty doing that, then during the editing phase, just change all of your past tenses to present tenses. So it wasn't that Hermia said to Helena, it's that Hermia says to Helena, as if it's happening in the now. So a couple of other points in terms of the proofreading stage that you might want to read backwards, because then you can focus on the sentences rather than on the actual argumentation. You're more likely to find errors that way. Read your paper out loud. You can oftentimes hear mistakes. And the title, which means that your paper should have a title, should be original. It shouldn't be called, for instance, A Midsummer Night's Dream. That title's already taken by Shakespeare. So it should reflect your thesis. There isn't any reason why you couldn't include the title within your own title. So something like Love in A Midsummer Night's Dream would be a unique title. And the convention for dramas is either underlining, or the titles of dramas, is either underlining them or putting them in italics. In other words, if they are longer pieces. The convention for putting the titles of shorter pieces, let's say a sonnet, would be in quotation marks. So when you see a title in quotation marks, you know that it's a shorter piece. When you see a title that's underlined or italics, you know that it's a longer piece, such as a novel or a drama. Your own titles would not be in quotation marks or underlined because yours haven't been published. Though if you are referencing the title of a poem or a longer piece such as a drama within your own title, then that literary text that you're referencing should either be in quotation marks or it should be underlined or in italics. And just to show you how old this handout is, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. Yes, your paper has to be typed, double spaced, 1-inch margins. The syllabus talks a little bit about the conventions for formatting a paper. You should also have a title page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists your name, my name, the due date, your paper title. There are no real conventions on how to format the title page. If you were to look at the MLA, which is the Modern Language Association, which comes up with all of these rules for the humanities, and that includes us in English, that title pages aren't necessarily required, but do submit if your instructor requests one. So I'm requesting one. And that the paper is due on the date assigned. So if it turns out that you need an extension, please ask me. Again, I'm hopeful that all of you can get in that paper the week after spring break, because that puts us more than halfway through the semester. So it would be a good idea to have some feedback at that particular point. And I will evaluate the papers both for our grammar and mechanics as well as for content, and give you some feedback in a letter grade and return that to you. And then you have the option of rewriting that paper for a higher grade if you so elect to do so by incorporating my comments. And if that isn't enough, we can always set up a meeting as well. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to hand in that revision. But the earlier the better for everybody involved. I just ask that you hand in the original with my commentary along with your revision so we can compare and contrast the two, or I can compare and contrast the two. And the second paper, since it's due at the ending of the semester, you wouldn't have a chance to rewrite it unless you were to submit it in early. So there is a possibility, but we would have to negotiate. But everybody has the option of rewriting the first paper. The idea behind the second paper is that you would have already learned how to write a paper through the first paper. So you wouldn't necessarily need to do a revision for the second one. So I see the first paper as kind of a draft, if you want to think about it from that way. Um, that allows you to do a revision if you so wanted to. So those are just some of the points on the handout, and you'll notice that in the notes below, I've indicated some information about documentation, which can be pretty complex. And again, this is a system that's determined by the MLA, the Modern Language Association, for the humanities. There are different systems or different rules for other disciplines, such as the APA, the American Psychological Association, but we're using MLA, which means that at the ending of the quote, what you usually do is add a parentheses, and within that parentheses, you would indicate a page number. But things are easier with Shakespeare because Shakespearean plays are divided into act, scene, and line. So after the quote, in those parentheses, and it doesn't matter whether you are going to continue your sentence. If so, after the parentheses, continue your sentence. If you're going to end your sentence, then after the parentheses, end your sentence. But in those parentheses is where you would indicate not page number, but act, scene, and line. And you can see some examples of that below, where you've got a capital Roman numeral for the act, a lowercase Roman numeral for the scene, and then you've got Arabic numbers for the lines. And you use a period to separate the act from the scene, and you use another period to separate the scene from the line. So again, if you're just quoting a word or two, you don't necessarily have to document it, as is in the first example with Hamlet speaks of himself as a dull and muddy-mettled rascal, for instance. But once we start quoting longer passages, in the second example, Hamlet imagines the world as, quote, an unweeded garden slash that grows to seed, unquote. So this would be quoted, and also it would be documented with the parentheses following. And it turns out that at the ending of that parentheses, the writer wanted to end their sentence. So that's where you would put your ending punctuation. And if you ever see a slash within a quote, that indicates a break in a line of poetry. So you know much of Shakespeare's writing is in poetry. So the ending of one line and the beginning of the next is shown through the use of the slash. And if you are quoting multiple lines, usually over 3 lines of poetry, then you wouldn't incorporate it into the body of the text. As you can see in the example that Hamlet begins his first soliloquy with the wish for self-destruction. And what we've got is a 4-line quote. So basically, you can just end the line where the line would normally end in the play, because this is a piece of poetry. And then you have your closing punctuation, and then afterwards you have your parentheses, and within the parentheses, act, scene, line. I honestly don't know why. It's just one of those things that you just have to follow. Kind of like in some states you can make a write on red, in other states you can't. You just have to basically accept the rules. If you're going to leave out a long passage, you could use either a ellipsis, which is 3 periods, or 3 dots. You might have seen that inside of a quote. When an author does that, that means that they aren't quoting the quote in its entirety. They've left out a word or several words that just aren't important to the meaning of the quote. You're not trying to change the meaning of the quote. That would be unethical. If you're leaving out a whole line of poetry, you could even just do a line of dots. And you can see the example of that with Hamlet reflects upon the temptation to destroy himself in the example below. So you can see that quoting is probably easier. If you're going to be quoting prose, in other words, complete sentences, you've got an example of this when we have world weariness overtakes Hamlet in his remarks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And then we've got the quote, and of course, since it's prose, you go from one end of the line to the other. And if it's less than 3 lines, you can incorporate it into the text. If it's longer than 3 lines, you would block it off. Basically, you would indent. And generally speaking, you use the ellipsis only when you're omitting something from the middle of a passage. You don't have to do it at the beginning or the end, because the assumption is that you are beginning your quote at a point that you've made a decision to begin with, but obviously there was more text before that. And the same with ending it. The assumption is there's more text after that. You've just decided to end your quote. So you usually use the ellipsis only when omitting something from the middle of a passage. So you can see that I've got some examples too from the MLA from actually my literature class. It happens to be a short story called Soldier's Home. Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college. In this instance, you can see that I'm using page numbers because short story is not divided into act, scene, or line. And if you want two good resources, the first that I recommend is Purdue OWL. You might have heard of this in other English classes. And in the fourth section, the notes below, I've got the website for Purdue OWL. And it is from Purdue University, and it goes through the entire writing process from generating ideas to submitting in a final manuscript, as well as conventions for documentation. So it's a great site that they've made available to the public. You don't have to be a student from Purdue. The GCC library is for GCC students, which is what you are. And I've included their web link with information about writing a citation because the GCC library is well aware that you are going to be writing papers and will need this information. So I recommend that you look at both of those. If you have further questions about writing, or of course you can always ask me as well. And writing tips, in addition to avoiding slang and trite expressions, I suggest that you try to avoid contractions when you take two words and you contract them to make one word. So for instance, taking the words do and not and making them into don't or can't or won't. It's not that it's wrong, but it's considered a little bit more informal. And when in doubt, probably better to be formal. And also, and this might seem counterintuitive, you can avoid the use of I think, I feel, I will argue. All of that can go. The paper is an entire analysis of what you think or what you feel or what you will argue. And again, if this is difficult for you to do when you're writing, just in the editing stage, delete all of the references to I. And of course, keep in the present tense, as I had indicated when discussing literature. So, next class, we are beginning Much Ado About Nothing. And in the notes below, in the sixth section, you can see that I've added a link from the Folger Shakespeare Library, though you can find Much Ado About Nothing in many places. And I'm also including a link for the film that we are going to be watching next class, but you might want to get a head start on it. It is an hour and 51 minutes, so it's a Hollywood film. So it's a very different kind of experience than what we saw with the Globe production. And I wanted to show you very different kinds of interpretations. For a Hollywood film, it's long at an hour and 51 minutes, but for a Shakespearean production, it's short. So I thought I'd give you the link now, so if it turns out that you wanted to use the weekend to begin it, and then we'll put some closure onto it on Monday, our next class. And for our attendance question today, and this will be due on Friday the 7th, and certainly if you need an extension, let me know. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, but I encourage you to do so. But you are required to read everyone's responses and my responses in turn. Your attendance question will be about paper number 1, since that's the bulk of what we talked about today. And what do you think will be your greatest challenge in writing paper number 1 and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with Much Ado About Nothing. Take care. Bye-bye.